Welcome everybody to the Open Source Exchange. My name is Dave McLoughlin. I am the Manager of Services and Solution Engineering here at Revenera. Couldn't be more excited to be holding this panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I get started, I just have a few logistics that I need to go over with everyone. So the first thing is that the platform that we've set up here today, unfortunately, we won't be able to hear you or see you, but your questions are really important to us. So please, in the interface, look for the place that you can chat with us. And if you have any questions during the discussion, please go ahead and enter those questions into the chat. If at any time you have any technical issues, there is a tech support button on the left-hand side of the screen that you can use to get technical support. And likewise, we also are monitoring the chat as we go along, so you can also use that for support. And then another thing that's really important is, as I mentioned in this platform, even though we can't hear you and see you, we'll be able to see your questions. At the conclusion of this event, our panelists will hop on over to Meet the Panelists room. You should see a button for that on the left side of your screen. If at the end of the discussion today, if you'd like to speak one-on-one with our panelists, please go ahead and click on that button and join us in the hop-in platform. And then finally, and something that I'm sure is something that may have enticed many of you to join today, is that we are going to be doing a random drawing at the end for a $200 Amazon gift card. And to encourage you to participate in today's panel and to ask questions, we're going to actually increase the number of entries that you have in the drawing each time that you go ahead and ask a question or enter a comment. And so actually, just to kind of get things started for the attendees today, for our audience, we'd love to know where you're dialing in from, if you will. And so if you could go to the chat and just put in where you're joining us from, we'd love to see that. Okay, with that, if we could put up the first slide, please. What I'd like to discuss next is, why did we put this panel together? If you look at what's been happening over the last couple of years, and really accelerating in 2020 and 2021, we see that essentially the software supply chain is under attack. Within Revenera, we have an organization that does security research called Secunia Research. And we saw over 30 plus zero-day advisories at the beginning of this year, more than we've seen in any other year before. And of course, if we go back to 2014 and look at Heartbleed, Equifax, in 2017, and then just in the last couple of years, with the sophisticated attacks on SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, and infrastructure attacks like the Colonial Pipeline, we really see that there's been, a level of sophistication in the attacks that we've never seen before. These attacks are well planned, and they're setting the stage for potential longer-term effects on the supply chain. And the other thing that we've seen as a result of this, where in the past organizations were really focused on security within their IT and their engineering organizations, we're seeing that these issues are now starting to make it up to the board level of most larger organizations. So it's really becoming an issue at the C-level. So combine that together with the fact that we're seeing a number of mandates and we're seeing a number of certifications of different types of data interchange for open source and software bill of materials. For example, the US government just issued a cybersecurity executive order. This has really jump-started the conversation around security. So some of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, what is the overall level risk in our applications? Do we have trust in our software supply chain? And if not, what tools and resources do we need to make it more secure? What are we doing around patch management to address these issues? Do we even have a process? And can we provide inventory of all of our open source components for security purposes? So these are just a few of the questions, and there's a host of other questions that need to be addressed. And that's the whole point of bringing this team of experts together. So we decided, it was time to pull together a panel of experts and decision makers to talk about the state of the industry, to learn a little bit from each other, what it takes in terms of people, processes, and technologies to navigate today's open source world. This is going to be an interactive and open-ended format, so please ask questions as we go. And with that, let me begin by introducing our panel. So if you could put up the next slide, please. So just to start, a little bit about myself. My name is Dave McLoughlin. As I mentioned, I manage the Solution Engineering and Services organizations here at Revenera. I've spent about the last 15 years working in open source software. I managed an open source audit team at a previous company, and I was a practice manager in our open source audit team here. I have a lot of experience in the auditing and due diligence around M&A in technology and open source. Next, I'd like to have Alex Rybak introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I'm Alex Rybak. I'm the Director of Product Management at Revenera, and I focus on our software composition analysis products. Like Dave, I've been in the industry for about 15 years. Joined Palamita back in 2006, which was one of the couple companies that pioneered the space. We're really kind of in an interesting point, right? Right now, we are kind of at the nexus of legal and security coming together, trying to mitigate risk together. Lots of external forces at play. We have an audit practice at Revenera. We're seeing the average size of the bill of material increasing significantly. We're close to 2,000 items per audit that we do these days. This is about a 3x increase over 2019. So we're really seeing yet another explosion of the use of open source. And if you take that with what Dave talked about as far as the security issues we're seeing, the ransomware attacks, the supply chain attacks, we're really kind of at a crossroads of huge reliance on open source, lots of increase in the volume of dependencies, lots of increase on the frequency of newly reported exploits. So we're kind of at the perfect storm for supply chain security. So kind of as a result of all this, there's been lots of movement around regulations, around industry groups trying to organize and come up with both guidance, process, and some options on what companies can do to try to get a handle on their use of open source software. So along with my role in product management, I'm also part of our open source review board. I'm part of our open source program office and our cybersecurity team. So I'm sitting kind of in the middle of all of these various compliance efforts that are really trying to mitigate the risk that we give our customers with the software that we supply to them. So I wanted to thank all the panelists for joining us today. Looking forward to the conversation, and it should be a really good session.
All right, Jilayne.
Hi, I'm Jilayne Lovejoy. I am a lawyer at Red Hat currently, and I've also been one of the leads on the SBX project, the Software Package Data Exchange, for about 10 or 11 years, including I've been one of the maintainers of the SBX license list, which hopefully some of you have heard of. I have had previous roles at Canonical. I was the open source counsel at ARM for a bunch of years, and sort of started my legal career and in open source at a company that doesn't really exist anymore called OpenLogic. That's how I know Dave McLoughlin. So I've probably worked at 3 out of 4 companies that have an open source business model, which has been a really great experience. I think the thing that I, from like an open source compliance and governance perspective over the years have seen, I think we're at hopefully a lot more sophisticated point than we were 10 years ago. There still is a great need for education, nevertheless. And the thing that I've seen more recently that worries me a bit is, I've referred to it sort of over-engineering open source license compliance. So I've seen some hints towards people kind of applying a one-size-fits-all approach, not really thinking about how they're using the software and how that should tailor and inform what kind of questions they ask or what kind of concerns they have. And I think that's concerning because it kind of potentially creates more work than there needs to be. And since it took so long just to get people to be aware that they do have to comply with the licenses, like, we don't want to like have the pendulum swing the other way and do more than is needed and find the right balance. I'm not really a security expert, but I see there's a lot of parallels so hopefully we can leverage those parallels, but also make sure to, keep an eye on the distinctions in terms of the processes for both those things.
Great. Thank you, Jilayne. Okay, Leon?
Hi, everyone. I'm Leon. For over 10 years now at GTC Law Group, I've advised companies, sort of big and small, on various aspects of IP law, but of course, including the benefits of open source software and the risks and how to best address them. And usually that's either in the context of events, so transactions and IPOs, or as part of governance and compliance programs. I'm a recovering software developer. I spent almost a decade designing and writing software for startups and multinational medical device companies. My first experience with license compliance, or perhaps better called non-compliance, was as an 8-year-old playing a pirated version of Star Trek on a Soviet IBM mainframe clone. And actually, I think this waste of computing power may or may not have indirectly led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I won't take all the credit. When not working, you can generally find me with skis attached to my feet and on a mountain. Dave did ask me to think about a thing that keeps me up at night, but I have an almost 9-year-old, so very many things keep me up at night. Professionally, however, I think, and most relevant for us here, I think one of the biggest challenges really is convincing the powers that be, and that's all of you in the room, that the importance of open source, the importance of open source compliance, and really that it doesn't have to be painful or costly to get yourself into compliance. So that's my biggest goal.
Great. Thank you, Leon. That was great. Okay, Martin.
Hello, everybody. Martin Callinan. So I'm based in the UK. I run a company called Source Code Control. I've been around managing software, both proprietary and open source, for well over 20 years. As a business, we help companies either who develop software to manage risk, both intellectual property and security related to the use of third-party components. We also work the other side of the equation. We work with companies acquiring software solutions to look at the risk in their supply chain. All the services we do typically are based around ISO 5230 open chain standard, which I guess we will talk about when we get into the session. What keeps me up at night? A lot of work we do is just with general technology companies who don't kind of badge themselves as open source, i.e. they're not open sourcing the code of the software they're developing. And because they don't perceive themselves as open source, then they don't feel the need to manage open source. So for instance, this session, being titled Open Source Exchange, a lot of companies we work with, they would feel it's not relevant to them. So what we see is a lot of technology being delivered to customers with underlying risk just because the companies don't feel there's a need to manage. I guess we'll talk about that in the session.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin. Neeraj.
Thank you, Dave. Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Neeraj Thakur, and I'm a product security engineer with Revenera, and have been in the industry of cybersecurity for quite 10 years now. And I have been looking mostly in the areas of penetration testing, in the areas of red teaming, in the areas of different kind of cybersecurity audits and reviews with respect to open source software, commercial softwares, with respect to licensing, and also with respect to the critical infrastructures as well. We all have been talking about a lot of things around the open source security in the IT. However, I just wanted to give a fresh perspective on the open source security in other sectors as well. like the sectors being the OT, which is the ICS, the critical infrastructure sector, the automotive sector, the manufacturing sectors. There as well, you have a lot of open source security or the platform issues, that how you're basically dealing with the bill of materials, how you're actually dealing with the security of your supply chain, how you're dealing with the security of manufacturing. So there are a lot of things that that are there in the these sectors as well, from the legal perspective as well, from the compliance perspective as well, from the security testing perspective as well. So I'm going to give you a perspective on that as well going forward in the session, and I'm looking forward to having a great session. What keeps me up at night, there are a lot of things which I can talk about. However, I would say from the open source security perspective, how the due diligence is being managed for open source components is one of the things that I look at very specifically, or how you're basically managing the access control, the authentication, authorization. These are some of the things which are very much of paramount importance, I would say.
Great. Thank you very much, Neeraj. That was great. And speaking of automotive industry, our last panelist, Russ.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. My name is Russ Eling. I'm the founder of OSS Engineering Consultants. We're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes design, implement, and manage their open source governance programs. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. In my last role at GM, I developed and implemented a successful open source program office and built the team responsible for reviewing software for use of open source in every GM vehicle across the globe. For what keeps me up at night, aside from my small children on occasion, thinking about the growth in software size and the sheer volume of direct and transitive dependencies that all need to be managed. It's getting really big.
All right, thank you very much, Russ. That was great. Okay, so I think the audience is now getting the picture that we've got one heck of a team that we assembled here. The number of years of experience, the breadth of experience, and the large corporations, small corporations, consultants, engineers, product managers. This is really going to be a great discussion today. So thank you again for joining us. So I've got a bit of a roadmap. You'll see it on my slide here for this discussion today. We've got 4 main topic areas. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a few questions related to each topic, kind of going top to bottom. As we're going through it, if anything, for the audience members, if anything, tickles your fancy, or you got an idea or comment, please go ahead and throw it in the chat. If it's applicable to the current topic, I will try to address it at the time, and I can bring it up and ask the panelists. And here are our 4 topics. The driving forces behind application security and secure code management adoption. Standards and regulations driving the increased software composition analysis initiatives. We talked about this, the security tsunami impact on software creators, security, engineering, and legal teams. And then finally, our 4th topic is managing software composition analysis initiatives to meet the growing risk demands. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to call on Martin. And now during this, I'm going to be asking questions. I won't necessarily call on a panelist. Please feel free to just jump in. But to kind of break the ice here, Martin, let's start by addressing this question. What role do software composition analysis tools play in application security?
Okay, the first thing I would say is SCA as a standalone discipline or technology is not the solution. Security is a business challenge, business risk. If you pass a vulnerability onto a customer, they get exploited, then that's a business problem. What we see is, because it's around software code, the knee-jerk reaction is to find a technology solution, but there's no process or people elements to the adoption of SCA. And we find then you get dissatisfaction in the technology. So then I buy another SCA tool and another SCA tool. The other thing that we see with SCA is not being able to effectively either interpret, particularly with licensing, interpret the results, but also action the results. So then again, you get dissatisfaction, and over time, people start not even looking at the data coming out of SCA tools. So to be successful, we would say it's a people, processes, technology thing, and the people and the processes, yeah, everybody in the business potentially would be involved in that. I see it more as a business management to define, the do's and don'ts, if you like. What's acceptable risk to the organisation. In smaller technology companies, we see companies by SCA and developers making their own decisions about what's acceptable. And I don't think it's fair that the developers should be doing that, if that makes sense. So first of all, I would say it's just part of the overall landscape of being successful in managing secure software development. SCA also has a role. A lot of focus is put on developments and kind of shift left. But you touched on the executive order talking about producing SBOMs. That's more shifting right. And actually, we have used SCA with companies acquiring software. So we're doing some work for household name software company who manage their software really well, but they're looking at managing their suppliers. So there's a security group who are working with software vendors that they use to run their business, and they're looking to use SCA. Even if those companies can supply software bill of materials, they're looking to independently assess how accurate that is, and does it meet their standards. So I think everyone thinks about SCA at the developer end, but I think at the other direction, when you produce a bill of materials, it's when you ship into a customer. So I think SCA has got an important role there. My other comment about SCA, which I see as a failing, is companies using it for static audits. Speak to some companies, either some compelling moments like due diligence, or we're about to release, a new version of an application, so you decide to do an audit. That's just not an efficient way to manage it. What happens in the period in between, particularly with security vulnerabilities, when there's daily, new vulnerabilities coming into play. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, great answer. I think you just answered my next 5 questions as well. So thank you so much. Actually, you know what? I wanted to actually depart from the roadmap just for a second, and I realized, we've brought in a bunch of experts on SCA, and we're throwing out that term SCA a lot and talking about software composition analysis. So to just kind of set a baseline, I'm actually going to ask if Alex Rybak would mind just taking a moment and defining what SCA is. I'm sure there's some people in the audience who go, what's software composition? What does that mean to me? And how does that impact me? So I'm sure there's some people in the audience aren't as familiar with the term as we are. So Alex, do you mind just taking a minute just talking about what SCA is and what the implications are?
Sure, and I think Martin kind of covered a lot of the bullets of it, but it's a term coined by Gartner many years ago, and the whole idea is it's certainly people, process, and tooling, right? As Martin mentioned, tooling alone will not get you the satisfactory result. So it is a way to achieve your open source strategy as an organization. It is a combination of policies, both from legal security perspective, as well as procedures on who scans, how do they scan, who analyzes, how deep do you go, how often do you do this, with kind of a goal of not only having consistency across the company, but being context aware, right? If you're, and I'm just kind of throwing names out there, but if you're Microsoft, auditing Windows is going to be very different from auditing the Edge browser, right? So you have to understand what is the level of risk that you're willing to carry for a given application or a given organization, whom you take code from, which ecosystems do you trust, which ones do you not trust? Are you pulling from Apache? Are you pulling from an individual developer overseas, right? So it's really important to understand where your code comes from, what processes it goes through before it reaches your customers, What are you going to do if an incident report occurs, if there's a licensing issue or a security issue? Who's responsible? How quickly do you have to fix it? So that it encompasses all of those points in a process with tooling and people assigned with roles and responsibilities.
Great, thank you for that definition. We should have started with that. Jilayne, this is a question for you. So you worked at ARM. We worked together at OpenLogic. We did a lot of M&A due diligence. You've probably, and of course, all your work with SPDX, you've seen a lot of changes, and with the impact, going back to Heartbleed and Equifax, and then, the attacks the last couple of years. What are the biggest changes you've seen to open source governance, security, and management over, let's say, like the last, 18 months to 2 years? Oh, you're on mute.
One thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is going back a little bit more than 2 years, but there was a period where how you governed your open source software, or, and the process around that was like considered almost like a trade secret by some companies, which I thought was crazy. And so I think, the point at which Open Chain got started, which I was a part of in the beginning, was really a breath of fresh air, because, why shouldn't we be open and exchange ideas about best practices and how people are managing software? I mean, I remember going around to my colleagues, the hallway conversations kind of thing at conferences, or, phone calls to friends I knew would talk to me to say, hey, I'm spinning up an entire management program basically at ARM, and I'd like to get some ideas on what you're doing. And the answers were all the same for the most part. And now if you were that person having to do that, you'd have a whole bunch of resources. You wouldn't have to rely on your network of private phone calls and so forth and so on. And so I think that is a huge change, and certainly for the better. I mean, it makes it easier for someone starting out, and to know there's reliable resources too, because there are always resources out there to some degree, but how do you know what you can trust? And I think having some go-to resources that have been vetted by a lot of people who know what they're talking about is a major improvement. And I think that's the biggest change. I mean, I think there's a lot more awareness. There's still pockets of, I heard some of the same questions the last couple of years on commercial negotiations that I did when I was at OpenLogic, however many years ago. So, some we're having, some
things don't change.
Some things don't change. Exactly. So, that keeping that in mind actually is kind of important, that, you kind of have to you still have to level set, and you have to be aware of when you need a level set, which sometimes is the hardest piece when you're, if you're talking to someone, especially in a negotiation or whatever. And I mean, obviously the emphasis on security, I think there's other people could speak to that more,
sure.
More depth than me, but it's just a huge focus, and obviously, quite important. So that, I think that it's become to the level of, executive orders and being in the headlines all the time, and a higher topic than it had been is probably the most obvious change on that front.
Got it. Okay,
it seems like a great validation of prior approaches, right? To have the executive order come out, to have all of this focus and much more understanding.
Great, absolutely. Russ, quick question for you. This topic is really about application security, I think, and Jilayne just actually hit on it. Do you see an overlap with open source compliance and security? I mean, is the security driving, different factors around the legal and the license compliance?
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, so from my perspective, inventory is critical regardless of your focus, whether it's open source compliance or the security of your open source software. One thing I always say is you can neither comply, secure, nor remediate any software you don't know is there. Or as President Biden said, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago in a national security memo, we cannot address the threats we cannot see. So for companies with an open source program office, or an OSPO for short, they likely already have this inventory, or at least have the tools to put that inventory together. And I think there's tremendous value for the organization when the OSPO can then provide that list of known open source to the security folks. And then the security staff can run all of their threat analysis against that robust inventory.
Got it. Great. So I'm going to go on to topic 2, which is the standards and regulations driving SEA initiatives. And we've been, as a panel, we've been throwing out a bunch of terms here: SBOMs, SPDX, open chain, ISO compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Martin has quite a bit of information on mandates and regulations in the European market. So I just really kind of like to open this up to the team. Maybe I'll start with you, Martin, on this one. What are some of the driving factors, for organizations to adopt SCA today? And maybe give us, like the European view of things, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting. The executive order has got so much press, obviously in the US, but around the world. But there's been regulations for some time, and also guidance and frameworks, which, although they don't specifically say software bill of materials, they say the same thing. So, for instance, 2019, in the finance sector, the PCI Council issued a secure software development framework. And in that framework, it explicitly states you have to track and manage third-party open source components if they're vulnerable, and have a strategy for remediating them. The European Union have been publishing guidance in different verticals. So, for instance, there's a standard for securing IoT. There's a standard for cloud applications, and almost the same language as used, in the PCI standard. It calls out the need to track and manage third-party open source compliance. Now, you touched on due diligence, and we support data for legal teams in due diligence. So the last 5 due diligence projects have been 4 have been related to cloud solutions. Everyone's going cloud, as you know, and things like these regulations have been a bit of a stoppage in negotiations. The IoT organization, when that standard was raised, they're selling primarily in Europe. Investors are saying, "What do we do? Do we do?" And it just delayed conversations. So adopting and conforming with those regulations is becoming quite a requirement. It's driving the visibility for sure. The one thing I want to say about the SBOM thing, and there is some discussion around this, is how they're going to be used. So it's one thing sharing an SBOM between, say, a software company and a customer, but there is talk about making SBOMs public. But obviously, if you've got a public software bill of materials, then potentially bad actors could look at ways of leveraging the data in that to exploit. So I think there needs to be some sort of control around, the distribution of SBOMs.
Got it. Great. What about maybe Alex or Jilayne, data interchange formats for the supply chain? Now, Jilayne mentioned she'd been working at SPDX for 10 years. Alex, I know with the executive order, Revenera is really focused now on, how do we take our tools and really assist people in creating a bill of materials, and and using different data formats. Maybe we could talk just a little bit about that, some kind of the driving. And I know there's ISO compliance on SPDX now as well. Maybe Jilayne, if you could just give a 2-minute spiel on SPDX and talk a little bit about that, and then Alex, if you could kind of color comment.
Yeah, so SPX stands for the Software Package Data Exchange, although I don't think we ever really use the full name so much because it's easier to use the letters. As always in the tech world, you have to have an abbreviation. And basically, it started in 2009, and with the idea of companies are asking for a software bill of material, and they're asking for it in different formats, and they're redoing the work at every step on the supply chain, and that is incredibly inefficient. So the idea was, the sort of in its super early days was, well, if we could create a standard way to communicate all of that information, then at least, that can be passed along and ported and used more easily. Obviously, back then, the focus was mostly on the information you'd need to do open source license compliance. I want to just emphasize that a list of open source components is not license compliance, although I think there's a lot of lawyers and people who think it is. List is not compliance. If there's one quote you take from me today, that is it. It's the starting point, of course. And so over the years, a lot of use cases have been added to SPX. So obviously security is something, and provenance, there's more going on in the spec than I can even tell you about, because I'm kind of stay in my little license list lane for the most part. But obviously, as you can imagine, there's a lot more activity increasing because of the various other things that have been going on that have been already been mentioned. One of the really great things I think about that an open data or an open standard facilitates and which operates just like an open source project is a lot of open source tooling. And so because SPDX has been around a long time, and maybe some of the tooling vendors on this call don't want me to say this, but there's a lot of open source tooling around that in terms of creating and scanning for licensing in particular, and then creating SPDX documents and being able to exchange that info in different ways. So that's pretty important. I think that tooling should be open source, quite honestly, and I think that's a real benefit that SPX has been around for a long time. SPX had already been named as one of the standards that meets the NIST framework prior to the executive order, and there's a lot of more working groups around that now for tooling, as well as the standards and sort of the minimal viable elements of an SBOM and so forth and so on. So. Of course, my part, if you will, of SPX has been the license list, which is extremely portable and usable, and much more than just an SBOM. One of my current sort of plugs, or current and past plugs, especially if you've ever done an audit, as I did many years ago, Dave, I think this has informed my whole career, is if you've spent time looking at source code to try to figure out what the license is, it'll scar you for life, and you will forever ask developers, please put the license info in a clear, concise, and easy to understand way, because that is just a waste of time. And if you're putting code out there, it's because you want people to use it, so make it easy for them to use it. So you can use SPDX license IDs in your source code, which is a great human and machine readable way to concisely tell people in a definitive way, this is what the license is for this particular piece of code.
Yeah, so something, Jilayne, that you said just triggered me, and it's the idea that once you've done it, you're really sort of in tune with it, and you never want to do it again. It also works. It also works the other way too. So one of the driving forces, I think, for organizations to adopt SCA isn't necessarily all the standardization, though that absolutely helps, but it's also the experience, right? Once someone has gone through a diligence event for M&A or for an IPO, right? That can be so painful if you don't have all of your ducks in a row, that the next time, right, when you start up again, you go, okay, I'm going to do this right this time. I'm going to do all of my review ahead of time. I'll make sure that I have all the answers. And then, of course, we're also seeing customers and especially sophisticated customers ask these questions now. We're seeing fundraising rounds that now have open source diligence attached to them, right? That didn't used to happen just a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, not to take Alex's thunder, but I think his definition of SCA was interesting. Actually, to me, it was a little broader than I thought, which I was glad to hear, because I think on your point, we used to talk about scanning, or, I think of audits as sort of being the people doing the scanning part, but that is, like you said, if you're doing that, it's kind of like driven by some event, or I think Martin mentioned that, and you got to build it into your process, right? You have to build the concept of tracking what open source you're using, or checking for security vulnerabilities in your development process. I mean, checking all that before it goes out the door via some kind of scanning solution is is sort of too late in both cases, I think. So I think there, I'm sure we'll get into that more, but baking that in, and I also think where education comes in terms of making, your developers and engineers aware of what they should be thinking about and being clear about what kind of processes they are on the front end is really the way to go.
Yeah, I think I'm just one comment, then I'll let you jump in, Alex. With the pandemic, with the interest rates and whatnot, we saw quite a bit of increase in acquisition activity, and consequently, internally at Revenera, we have an audit team, and we saw quite an increase in M&A activity, and it goes kind of hand in hand with what you said, Jilayne. It's a little bit too late, but it's still a big business. That at the time of technology acquisitions, people have to go in and build SBOMs because a lot of organizations just don't have the process to build them as they're building their products, and so there's still quite a bit of demand for that, and that's still a viable part of the market. Alex,
it's a bit strange. It's a bit strange to me though, the due diligence. So you do an SBOM, which is a point in time data point, and then you fix whatever issues there may be, and then the investor invests or the buyer buys. And then they just go back to the way they were developing, building up the same problems.
Hopefully not.
Well, unless they change their processes, that's going to happen. What we saw with leveraging OpenChain is an investor say to the company they were buying, you have to be conformant with OpenChain within 3 months. It is one of the terms of the investment. So a continuous process beyond. Because they weren't managing it at all prior.
All right, so lots to unpack there. Let me kind of, I guess, go response by response. So to Leon's point, which is really good, is the founders of a lot of today's SCA companies are ones that were burned in previous companies, either having to go through a diligence event or their company about to get acquired, and then somebody realizes there's licensing issues or vulnerabilities that haven't been managed. So I think everybody personally has felt the pain. I've done many hours of auditing in my career in SCA, so I totally agree with Jilayne's point. You want the tools to do most of the work for you, but you want the process and policies in place to not have the output of the tools just kind of fall to the floor. So they need to go into something, and that's going to be policies on what's acceptable, what's not, and then hopefully that'll be data that goes to stakeholders. And it used to be that it was really legal security that was concerned. Now we got export teams that take a feed. We got security teams that take a feed. If you happen to be in an industry where human safety is an issue, there's compliance and safety officers. And then ultimately your customers and your customers' customers are all kind of expecting you to do the right thing in a trustworthy manner. So initiatives like OpenChain are great because they kind of simplify things, and they don't necessarily propose how to do it, but they propose a checklist of what your program needs to do and needs to accomplish, and kind of the main foundational pieces so that your program can be trusted. And it also takes away complexity from having to explain your program to a simple statement that we are OpenChain conformant, and then go read the spec and you understand what that means. So it gives a lot of legitimacy to it. As far as kind of the original question around standards, so yes, SPDX has been around a long time. It's certainly one of the more familiar formats. Cyclone DX is another one. Software IDs is a third one. At the end of the day, it has to be a conversation on where do you get your code and who gets your code downstream, right? If everybody's using SPDX and your customer is using Cyclone DX, there's a translation that will have to be done. So tooling is important, but also understanding your ecosystem and who your suppliers are, who your customers are, who your customers' customers are, and kind of at least loosely agreeing on an overall process. Common tooling will help, but it's not mandatory, right? There's code out there to be able to understand different inputs and normalize them. Lots of tooling around SPDX is available, lots more I'm sure coming as SBOMs get more defined and kind of more of a mandate comes in than just guidance at the moment. So those are the three kind of leading formats. I do think eventually there will be one kind of main one that's adopted. And certainly the points Jilayne made around kind of the evolutions in the new version of the specs around How do you take the bill of material? How do you infuse that with security information? It churns quickly, right? You don't want to invalidate your SBOM by putting vulnerabilities directly into it, which an hour later will change. So how do you tie those two pieces of data together? How do you keep it up to date? How do you not require a human to have to be involved in the process? And then how do you share that across organizations in a manner that it can be pulled in and used to make business decisions?
Great. Okay,
well,
I'm going to
Dave,
take. Go ahead, Neeraj.
I had a point basically. Jilayne and Alex both talked about how the developers are also being developers are also needed to be aware of what open source security is or how we are using the open source components.
Yeah.
It is of paramount importance, when we are dealing with any of the open source component, that the developers should be aware of all the nitty-gritties of how these open source components are being integrated in the product that they are developing. Now we are all talking about, secure by design concept in any of the product or application that we are developing. So it should be secure since the inception of the product. We are talking about the product which is from the design phase to the test phase, or it goes to the release. So the security has to be embedded in each phase of development cycle. We are all becoming, DevOps. We are all following the DevOps model. Now, from the DevOps model, everybody has moved to the DevSecOps model, wherein security is already embedded, as part of each phase of your cycle. And that basically, increases the importance of having the awareness sessions or any kind of workshops for the developers who are developing the applications products, so that they are well aware of what products they are using, what are the vulnerabilities, how they should be, how those vulnerabilities are being identified in the first place. Because if you do not identify the vulnerabilities in the first place, you go ahead and go for the release. After the release, or maybe in the testing phase, you get the pen test done, you get a lot of vulnerabilities out of the open source components. Because one of the Fortify researches I was going through some earlier this month, that says that 300,000 plus open source components are being used annually, or they are being downloaded. 1 out of 10 open source software have well-known vulnerabilities. 71% of the vulnerabilities in the open source has increased since 2014. So these are some of the data points which one should look at from the organizational or enterprise perspective, so that they go ahead and train their developers, they train their organization from a security aware point of view. And this is basically from the secure by design concept, that you have open source software or the third-party libraries very well tested, audited, or you have due diligence in place for them.
Yeah, so Neeraj, let me jump in real quick because we got several audience questions that are kind of relevant to your response. So let me start with a quick comment, and then I'll kind of try to summarize these questions into one. So I wanted to bring the topic of training in real quick. So as you mentioned, more and more burden is being shifted to developers, right? Before, developer used to be responsible for innovating, writing code. Today, there's lots of compliance actions, there's security expectations, but typically none of the developers were educated in any of this as part of their computer science program. So it's really kind of on industry, on organizations, on companies to make sure that there is training involved, right? It's not fair to expect developers to understand open source licensing, to understand open source security, and by the way, to understand whatever programming language you have to write code in. So that's an important point, that training has to be part of the solution here. You can't just make people accountable but not enable them to succeed in what they're accountable for. So as far as audience questions, there's been several different ones. I'm going to kind of summarize it into one. So the question is really about the fact that the dependency chain is getting huge, right? You can work on a fairly small piece of code, and by using Node or NuGet or one of the popular repositories, you can easily bring in hundreds, if not thousands, of dependencies. So is there, are there thoughts around how to wrap security around that, right? This is code your company didn't write. You're likely unaware of the transit dependencies that are being pulled in because they're not your direct dependencies. So what are your thoughts around how to apply security to that context and how to get control over what code is coming into your product that you don't have direct control over?
The first thing that I think, Alex, is we need to have the OSS discovery in place. Okay, when you have the OSS governance model in place, any open source governance model for that matter, you need to have the open source discovery in place, which will basically tell you what all components you have in place. Many of the products or applications that I have tested as part of the penetration testing, or maybe as part of the reverse engineering, we see that a lot of libraries are already existing within the application which are not being used. So why are they being, why are they even existing as part of the application in the first place? There's no use of it. So the first thing that comes in place is whenever you are trying to build any application or product, you need to have a good level of discovery for any of the open source that we are trying to utilize. Once you have the discovery happen within the product lifecycle or the product development lifecycle, you are aware of the amount of open source components that you have. Once you're aware of that, these are the open source components that I have, you can go ahead and you can have a strategy, or you can have a plan for either discovering the vulnerabilities, or mapping out or finding out what are the known vulnerabilities for those open source components. That can be one of the ways you can look at it.
Good, excellent. And then there's another question I wanted to kind of direct to the legal folks, so Jilayne or Leon, the distinction between freeware and open source, kind of a fine line there. So any comments on how people should think about that, and if it's one process or separate processes to deal with it?
So maybe I'll start and Jilayne can correct me. That way will work great. So my take on it is you treat them exactly the same way, and I would even say you treat commercial software the same way too. Your review process is your review process, right? What you're trying to do is you're trying to align your usage with what you're allowed to do under the license. And so whether it's an open source license or whether it's freeware software, whether it's a commercial license, at the end, right, it's still that alignment. So whether it's the same people that do the work, whether it's procurement looks at commercial agreements and somebody else looks at open source, but ultimately, I think it's the analysis itself is fairly universal.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could just lump all of that together as third-party software, right? So your review is anything that's not yours. And I think the reason if you think like sort of almost like from an evolution standpoint, the reason that we talk about open source as being reviewed maybe separately is because if you have to buy software, it kind of forces a review because money and signatures are involved, right? So your company, we used to say this way back, it's like your company probably already has a process for that, but it doesn't have a process for something that's free, as in beer. And but the other thing I will just add is and I think this touches upon, Alex, your point about education. And so one of the things I've done, I feel like my entire career as an open source attorney has been educating people, whether it's other lawyers or engineers or salespeople or whatever. And one of the things I always start with is like kind of a little couple slides if I'm doing a presentation on terminology, because it's really confusing, all these terms that sound alike. And I always make the point to say, free software and open source software in terms of sort of from a licensing and from a pragmatic perspective are the same. There are philosophical differences in why we have those different names. You might hear it lumped together as free/open source software or FOSS. And then I always make the distinction to say that freeware is usually like every app you download on your mobile phone, or not everyone, but probably most of you, because we all like free ones, right? The thing that's free is in no cost. Probably you only have binary, and you probably have some license that says, you can use it on one device or two, it has restrictions. So it's free, but it's not open. And then I usually, then also talk about public domain and the sort of legal definition of that and what that means, because, there's sort of seemingly, sometimes there's overlap. I mean, something that's in the public domain may also be open source because the source code's available, or maybe not. And now, of course, we have newer licenses in the last few years that are source available, is I think the term we're using, they look a little bit like an open source license. Sometimes they look just like an open source license, and then there's some restrictions stuck in there, usually having to do with commercial use, or the other flavor is sort of other restrictions on certain types of use that that the authors don't want to see for maybe more ethical reasons. But in any case, it's not aligning with the 4 freedoms or the open source definition in terms of no field of use restrictions. So it is kind of confusing, and I think that is a really important starting point, because if you don't, I used to say, look, I'm going to do this presentation, and I know a lot of engineers sitting there like, oh God, I know all this already. I don't need to hear this. And I'm like, but if we're not speaking the same language and I say something and you think I mean something totally different, we're starting out like with a problem. So I think that's an important distinction.
Great. So go ahead, Neeraj.
I mean, while Jilayne was, talking about these things, I just I strike with a thought wherein people say that, any free code or free software, that is not actually free. It comes with a cost, and the cost is responsibility and the accountability. And when it comes to accountability and responsibility within any organization, nobody really wants to take that.
So that's actually a great lead in to the next question. Thanks for that. So the audience has been asking the last couple of questions we did were actually from the audience, and keep them coming. They're really good. As a matter of fact, we have this whole list of questions that we wanted to do today, but honestly, the questions that we're getting from the audience are better. So this next question, I'm going to actually point it at you, Russ, and maybe Martin, you can give some thoughts here as well. Where would you think an open source program office fits best in an organization? Would it be part of DevOps, engineering, quality, IP, legal? Where in the software development lifecycle should the FOSS assessment be fit in? Thought this might be according to how each organization is built. Do you have a view on where would be the best place to start?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at this from a perspective of like, how do we get this off the ground? It's where you're going to get the most traction, I think. I've seen the open source office. So you need buy-in, you need budget, and everything. So that's
real quick, Russ. When you worked on the OSPO at General Motors, what organization did you live in? Were you working in?
It started in electrical engineering, and then it eventually moved over to security.
Oh wow. Okay.
Electrical engineering is a very logical place to start. Right?
Well, it is. So it's got that like broad governance,
right,
and
exactly.
It hits a lot of different business units. And when you're talking about, in the context of a vehicle, you have to hit all of those different business units that are responsible for all those different modules or ECUs in a vehicle. So it's quite complex. We ended up moving over to security afterwards, but. For everybody else, I mean, I've seen this in several places in an organization, from electrical engineering to security to legal. Again, it's where are you going to get the most traction to get this off the ground? You're going to need budget and other resources. And once you have something in place, or at least started with that traction, I think then you can figure out where, if you're doing this on your own anyways, you can figure out where it might naturally end up longer term.
Got it.
It sometimes becomes a hot potato of I don't want it, you take it. And that could be a problem. But
budget from that perspective too. They don't want the liability.
Well, and
exactly.
I think also the success depends a lot on the owner, right? I mean, it's a thorny subject for a lot of organizations from a business perspective. What's the return on investment of building an OSPO, right? What's the benefit we're going to get to the organization? And so you need someone who's passionate, who understands the business, right? And someone who can own it and drive it regardless of, where it starts in the organization. Martin, you do a lot of open chain consulting with your clients. Where do they usually start?
My comment on all this, it doesn't really matter where it sits. What does matter is you need, something you touched on, Dave, you need an executive sponsor who's bought into the project and represents the project at a board level, to get secure funding, but also just to keep the interest, at the senior management level, and to increase that investment. So for me, it doesn't matter where it sits, it's who owns it ultimately and who's going to bat for you within the organisation to keep it current and invested in.
Got it. Great.
Yeah, I think the other point to consider is this kind of a top-down or bottom-up initiative, right? Top-down, if it's being pushed by your board, by your C-level execs, it's going to naturally start with a home. If it's a team that realizes that they got to do this to make their job possible, then you're going to search for a home over time.
The downside to that, though, Alex, is when you get one particular business unit that takes this initiative on, they go spin up a team and a process, and maybe they put some tools in place, and then you've got all the other business units that are doing varying degrees of something or nothing.
Yep, so it's got to bubble up quickly.
Yeah.
Yep. I would just add a couple things. I was just chuckling because I think it's a great question where it sits, and I think I've kind of asked that as well, and it runs the gamut. And I mean, I spun up the open source office at ARM, and at one point someone asked me, like, well, is this something that legal should do? Because I happened to be the one driving it and was in legal, but and it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's whoever's going to take it on, because at the end of the day, and I think Russ and Martin both said this, implicitly, it has to be cross-functional. So, which is why it sort of sits in different places in different companies, probably, just based on a bunch of somewhat random factors, like maybe who started it, and how it evolved, and the top down, all the things that you guys already said. And so, but like at the end of the day, the people who comprise it have to sit in different parts of the company anyway. So, that's to me, the most important piece, that you're pulling together, people from marketing and people from legal and obviously people from engineering and, from all the different aspects. Because otherwise, if you don't have that cross-functional perspective in terms of, weighing in on the various processes and all the different aspects of open source, and that's not just compliance, that's how you're contributing, how you're managing your participation in the community, and so forth and so on, then, you're not going to have a kind of a complete picture.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we just had another question come in. We're kind of going a little bit off topic here, but and I think maybe this is for you, Neeraj, but anybody else, please feel free to jump in. Can we trust tools that use artificial intelligence algorithms to analyze code and, quote, track dependencies for possible bad actors, or are we better off weighting the outputs from such tools?
Well, it's a tricky question, actually. However, to talk about any tool that we use, be it the tool using the artificial intelligence or any other technology for that matter, we need to first have the understanding that what this tool does and how the output of the tool is going to be like. Is it actually falling in the, the kind of requirements that I have? And is it actually taking a lot of inputs from me? How much input am I supposed to give to the tool? And what is the output that am I supposed to get out of the tool? That is most important. If the tool is taking too much of input, which is not really required, I believe that the tool is not really doing, the job that it should do. Okay, from the security point of view also, because, there are a lot of things which are coming in place nowadays. If you talk about data protection, you talk about the access controls. Okay, these are some of the factors which are very important when you're talking about or when you're dealing with any of the tools. How the code of that tool is managed, how that particular tool is being integrated with any of the, other components within your infrastructure. That is also one of the important things that you should think of, rather than just going about, thinking that whether this particular tool is using AI, so it is good, or maybe it is not good. So that is not one just thought that we should go with. Rather, we should have a thorough due diligence of the tool. That what is the input that am I giving to the tool? What is the output? Is it expected or not? And what is it that is being taken from me? That is something to be thought of.
Right. Absolutely. Okay.
Dave, I think there's an extension.
Go ahead, Martin.
I think there's an extension to that question about AI. What about tools that actually create code? So like GitHub recently launched Copilot, and there's all sorts of IP issues related to that. Who's the copyright holder and things like that. So it's automatically generated code, which will pull in dependencies and you arguably got no control over that. And what risk is that, putting in a supply chain?
Got it. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Okay, we're going to go on. Thanks again to the audience for great questions. We're going to go on to our section 3, which is really, this whole security, what we're calling the security tsunami impact on, software engineering, security, and legal teams. So let's see, we've got a bunch of questions there. I think I'm going to actually jump to Neeraj and go to this question about, as a security person, do you treat open source differently, from the code that you're developing or other commercial third-party code that you're putting in your product?
Well, I would not really say, Dave, that we treat it differently. Rather, we treat it more sophisticatedly. Okay, because any of the open source component that we are, taking in place, we do not really know that how that has been developed. Okay, the authors, it might be a known author, it might be an unknown author that we are, taking the code from. And it takes a lot of, responsibility, and it takes a lot of understanding to really integrate that code with something else that you want to work, maybe ahead for the product or for the application. So when we talk about really, going about the open source components, we do a thorough testing of the open source component with respect to, security, be it the with respect to OWASP top 10 or be it with respect to SANS 25. So these are some of the, global standards which are applicable or which are, being thought of, which are being basically everybody is following these standards globally. So just apart from that, we also go ahead and do it manually. I mean, the manual pen testing or the manual review of the code, the source code review, static analysis of the code, that will actually reveal that what is the, how the code is being written, whether it is a secure code or not. There are different guidelines given by OWASP as well on the secure coding guidelines, that how you code a product, how you code a plugin, or how you code an application. So you should take care of all these, kind of, global practices or leading practices while you are developing the code or while you are using any open source components. At least we should have a check on these kind of practices, that whether we are actually following that or not.
As a non-security but legal person, I really like your answer. At the end of the day, right, wherever the code comes from, it's in your product, and you're responsible for it. So if you say, "Oh, well, this came from somewhere else. It's open source. It's been peer reviewed. Nobody cares," right? I don't have to do as much. That's not the right approach, right? You're ultimately responsible for what goes out the door. So I think your answer is absolutely spot on from the legal chair over here.
Yeah, no, just quickly jump in from kind of the product side, right? So I think from how do you identify issues? You may have different tooling, different processes, different cadences. How you address the issues is a single funnel, right? So every item discovered, regardless if it's code you wrote or code that you pulled in, like Leon said, it's in your product, you're responsible. It's got to be prioritized in one bucket and one list and go to the engineering team.
Okay, so with security being paramount now on code, and we've been talking about bringing third-party code, open source in. What about the legal and security challenges of acquiring code? So, what the question is, what are the legal and security challenges if you're dealing with open source from an M&A perspective?
Well, that can be a completely separate 2-hour-long presentation. In fact, it has been. But yeah, I mean, it really impacts everything.
That's our next session, Leon.
Yeah, all right, let's do it. We'll do it right after this one. Lock the doors, nobody leaves. So yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it impacts absolutely everything, right? You can delay your transaction. You can get into price adjustments because of, you found something and the cost of remediation is so high that it actually impacts the price of what you're paying. You can be, if you're selling and there's a lot of stuff that's not known, you don't have a policy in place, nobody knows what's going on, right? There's sort of the premium for unknown that comes into play as well. you can get into all sorts of closing conditions and wonderful legal documents that we can, I can share a screen of just wonderful legalese that puts your deal at risk. You're dependent on third parties, right? So sometimes you're using something, it's not quite clear if you're allowed to be using it. Maybe you've got to reach out and ask. Maybe that person decides to respond to you on deal timing, maybe not. Right. Sometimes it can kill the deal. I mean, it's rare, but sometimes you get to a decision versus, do I buy this? Do I build my own rather than dealing with all these issues, that have come up? And then there's diligence, right? If you can't provide the basic materials that you need to provide if you're on the sell side during diligence, you're going to have a bad time. Any sort of surprises that come up, right? It's always, whenever we're on the sell side of a transaction, I like to have answers for questions that I haven't been asked yet, right? Because you know they're coming, right? They're going to get that scan report. They're going to look at all of those things. And as Jilayne said earlier, and I think a lot of people have said it earlier, that this code scan report isn't the end of the process. It's really the beginning, right? And so they're going to look at that they'll look at some of the problematic things they find on there, and they're going to ask questions. And it's really good to have answers to those questions ahead of time, just because otherwise, you get into a situation where it's a fire drill. And then there's your reps, right? So every deal for the last many, many years has reps that are related to open source software. And if you can't make your reps cleanly, then that's a problem.
I'll have a nice sort of bookend to Leon's comments, which are great. I had the perspective of being on the in-house and buyer's end on a large number of deals. So I think the advice as the seller to be ready with the answers is spot on. I had a litany of questions that I would ask potential targets about open source. I previously worked as a researcher, so I know how to ask all the questions in a way so you have to answer it from different angles, because that's a really good way to see if they've actually answered it. But, at the end of the day, because I was coming from the in-house perspective, so I'm talking and sort of interrogating people who are potentially, hopefully going to be my coworkers. I try to just use it as, again, like a point of education. And, my expectations are usually pretty low of what I'm going to find. Sometimes I'd be pleasantly surprised. But I never actually saw anything that was like a deal killer. I'd always get asked that by the sort of corporate guys, and there's definitely some mitigation efforts, but nothing really outrageous. I think there's a lot of FUD still, and fear spreading around that. I mean, which is unfortunate, but at the end of the day, you kind of want to work with those people, right? And then you want to make sure to Martin's point earlier, again, I can say from an in-house perspective that, your most important thing is what do you do after they're acquired, and making sure you have that integration piece and everything's connected is also, obviously important. The other thing that I think is really helpful, and I kind of learned this lesson way back with Dave at OpenLogic. We kind of gave a talk about, this is so long ago, it's crazy, that, good open source compliance practices are consistent with good engineering practices. And so when I was doing the due diligence on a potential acquisition, I was looking at open source issues, primarily, and other IP related issues in any software they had. I would find sort of my engineering partner, who is also someone, right, in my company, and be like, hey, I want you to look at this stuff with me and be on some of the calls, because usually one of the more interesting things that we discovered by way of, having an outside company do an audit and then talking to them and having them answer all the questions and follow-up questions that came out of that was about their engineering practices. And so the value wasn't necessarily all on the legal side or whatever. It was another, viewpoint for my engineering colleagues into how they develop their code. And, I was involved in the security side, but I'm sure probably you could say a similar thing, I'd imagine.
Great. So related to this topic of, how all these, the security tsunami is affecting different organizations, Neeraj, we had a question come in from the audience that I think is actually a perfect fit for this topic. It says, are there any innovations in the application security space that are creating more room for vulnerabilities, creating gaps where vulnerabilities can sneak in?
If I talk about any of the innovations, I really don't think that it's creating any room more for the vulnerabilities. Rather, I would say that, the era of security is ever evolving. Okay, it's very dynamic, and we all need to be, keep up. We all need to keep up with the ever-changing dynamics that security has. If we do not do that, we are going to be outdated, and that will create the gaps or any kind of open spaces for the vulnerabilities to come in, or you might miss with some of the processes which should have been there, but we did not follow. Okay, so that awareness, that kind of to keeping up with the technology, that becomes a challenge, I believe, because it's very, very dynamic nowadays, and every other day you see something or the other is changing, some other technology is coming up, and there is some other innovation coming up. So to keep up with that, I think, is very important.
Got it. Fantastic. So the last question I have related to this topic is like the impact of security on organizations and how they train their staff, whether it's engineering, IT, whether it's just across the board. What is the role of training in the use of open source and composition analysis, and what kind of changes have you seen, in organizations? Martin, you do a lot of open chain work. I would imagine there's a lot of training involved in that. Are you seeing an increased demand for training related to open source?
Yes, I mean, training's fundamental. One of the challenges is there's lots of things to be trained on outside of this. So it's getting interest in particularly developers. If you kind of legislate or force training on people, they're generally not bought into, paying attention and things like that. It's a pity Andy Knapp's not on the call, so I know one of the ways to get engagement is to introduce a level of kind of competition, friendly competition. So like have leaderboards for best secured software, and complete training course, you get some kudos or whatever reward. That really works in the developer environment. Where I see it failing is when all of a sudden the training course comes out, mandatory training course, there's no explanation why, so people aren't bought into it. So I think it's really important to get that buy-in. Otherwise, it's just a tick box exercise. We trained everybody, and then everyone goes back to what they were doing. Better off. Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's move on to our final topic. We've got about looks like about 13 minutes left in our time here. So I'll ask a couple more questions. Alex, do you want to take that question on the OSPO?
Yeah, we had a question from the audience that we covered a little bit, but I think we need to get back to a bit. So the question was around OSPO stakeholders, right? Who needs to be part of an open source program office? So certainly, legal security, but a lot of it also depends on your business. So, I guess I'll start with Russ, since you're most intimately familiar with OSPO. But you mentioned, right? It's a cross-functional role, right? So it's got to cut across engineering, got to cut across product. So people have to have a stake in the entire process.
Yeah, I usually try to build a team of experts that they have the depth of knowledge in open source and how to deal with it. And then of course you've got your stakeholders, but they're not generally directly or organizationally tied to the OSPO. So that would be your executive champions, obviously, people in security, legal, obviously, potentially with procurement, so you can develop those relationships so that you're also looking at open source in anything you're bringing into your company under commercial terms or otherwise. High level, I think that's it. I know we're short on time.
Yeah, I think the other important thing to note is, whatever your OSPO puts out is going to be a burden to engineering ultimately, right? They're going to have to do more. So it's important to get buy-in from engineering leaders. It's important to get buy-in from product team because it's going to impact roadmap. There's going to have to be room made for following best practices and doing more scans and remediation. So it has to be a top-down mandate. It's really hard to get anything accomplished if it's one team trying to champion this with no buy-in from up top. So yeah, executive sponsorship, really critical.
Great. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. Just a quick shout out to the audience for the people who've stuck with us this long. Thank you so much. You know, I've been involved in open source for over 15 years, and I found this discussion just absolutely fascinating. Aside from being the moderator, this was really tons of good information. We had a lot of questions that we would have loved to cover today that we didn't get to. Many thanks to the audience for your questions were just absolutely fantastic. Love to get your feedback if you want to throw some comments in. About the format. Did you like this? We've discussed it internally. We'd really like to continue this discussion in the future and use this as a standard, type of panel format that we can continue to, continue the discussion in the future. So we'd love to get your feedback. Did this work for you? Was this valuable? Was the format right? Etc. Please provide format comments. So to wrap up, so we're down to the last 10 minutes. I don't know if I discussed this with the panelists, so maybe this will come as a surprise to you guys, but gonna throw a little curveball at you. What I'd like to do is just go around the room and ask you, and I'll give you a second, so I'll kind of blather on here a bit. Think about what we discussed today. What were your key takeaways? And maybe not your key takeaways, but maybe what's the audience key takeaways from today's discussion? What would you like to leave them with? Jilayne said, if you take one thing from me, take from me that a list isn't a solution, something like that. And I'm sure she can elaborate on that. But let's just go around the room. Leon, you're smiling, so I'm gonna pick on you first. What's your key takeaway for today?
I didn't do a very good job of hiding under my desk. Out of school for a while, so out of practice. I think, well, if I leave you with a soundbite, it'll be putting my software developer hat back on and saying that if you're putting together an open source policy and it's longer than 2 pages, tear it up and start again. Because I've seen ones that are 20 or 30 pages long and no one reads them, no one follows them. I've had developers tell me as we're brought in to review existing policies, the policy is great, but it takes 3 to 6 months for me to get approval for an open source component that I need to use. So I actively work against this policy. I don't contribute anything. So I guess the thing that I want people to walk away from is that open source isn't scary. It's not bad. It's not complicated. I mean, it is complicated in some ways, but there are people out here, and a lot of us on this call and a lot of others that can help you. There's a lot of resources out there. OpenChain puts out great stuff. A lot of stuff from SPDX too as well. So get going, get started, right? If you're sort of floundering and you don't know what to do, right? Seek out help. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be painful. Make it work.
Great, thank you, Neeraj. I'm gonna go to you next.
Yep. So my key takeaway for the audience, Dave, would be that basically security is not any one person's responsibility. We all have to think about security, collectively. Okay, and any of the open source component that you're using, I personally would say, do not trust any of the components that you're using. Take it, take it as a fresh component that maybe you have built, and take it from that perspective that how we are going to evolve in security, be it any component that we are using. So security is, again, everyone's responsibility, and everyone should start thinking about any of the product or application from a security standpoint. That's a value add for any of the organization, I would say.
Great, thank you, Russ.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but it would be the importance of having that accurate inventory of your open source usage. And I'll rely back on my soundbite there. You can neither comply, secure, nor remediate any software you don't know is there. And once you have that data and that inventory, there's a lot that you can do with that information, and it's beneficial to the entire company, or it can be.
All right, Jilayne.
Well, I guess I'll have to go with my go off the theme of my since you mentioned it. So I said that a list is not compliance. So I think this is kind of reiterating what Russ just said and building off of that. That there's more to it than that. And why are you being aware of why you're asking for what you're asking? So it shouldn't, use case matters, right? If you're buying software and you're not redistributing it, your questions to your vendor should be different than if you are redistributing it. Now, security, that may, in particular for open source license compliance. And I think I have to say, since I work at a company that deals in open source, is that, everything we've talked about when it especially comes to compliance is really specific to, proprietary or mixed proprietary and open source software. And, if you just provide everything in the source code, a lot of these problems do actually go away.
Great, thank you.
So, plug for open source.
Okay, a list is not compliance. Martin.
My takeaway would be whatever you do, it should be continuous. So not static audits, static bill of materials, continuous compliance, licenses change between versions, new vulnerabilities every day. So continuous security. And my other comment would be it should start in design, not after you've already developed the product and then try to retrofit a management solution on it.
Great, thank you. And Alex.
It's always good to go less with original comments here. So I'm just going to piggyback off of what everybody
Did they take all of your key takeaways?
Right. So I guess I have 3 listening to everybody's takeaways, which are great. So yes, absolutely continuous. Don't start with tooling, start with process, right? If you don't, you need to understand why you're doing this. Everyone at the company ideally needs to have some stake in it and understand how their role fits in. It's like any other corporate initiative, right? If you don't understand the why, you don't have buy-in, then 3 people are going to engage. So understand what your role is, understand how it makes your life better by not having to have fire drills later if you don't do it right, and educate everyone who's accountable so that they can succeed.
Great, thank you very much. To the panelists, thank you so much for preparing and taking time out of your day to do this. A lot of incredible knowledge shared today, so thank you so much for that. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have this hop-in platform. I guess there's a button on the interface on the left-hand side of your screen. If you do want to discuss live with the panelists, we're going to head over there, I guess, for a little bit more, and hopefully you'll join us and we can continue the conversation there. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Thank you, especially the panelists. Certainly appreciate it. Everybody have a great day. Thank you. Bye now.